Hello everybody and welcome to Science Live once again. We're coming to you on the Monday after Easter from the Creation Museum in Petersburg, Kentucky. It is a windy day. We've had some storms in the east and thinking especially of people down in Mississippi and Louisiana where there were some bad tornadoes and praying for those families and communities there and all those affected. But we are joined today by Dr. Jennifer Rivera. She's going to teach us more about fingerprints. So last week we had Boomer in.
Yes.
We tried to get Boomer's prints, paw prints, and it wasn't quite as cooperative as we had hoped for, but we got to talk through some of those things and how animals, God's created them with these textures on their paws and hands and things to be able to climb and those types of things. So we're back today for more discussion of fingerprints and how God's made every fingerprint on every person unique. And that gives us some advantages in the criminal justice realm, which is kind of your background. So just describe your background again if anybody missed the broadcast last week.
Yes, so I do have a background in fingerprints. That was my expertise when I worked in the crime scene unit. So I've had several hundred hours of training on fingerprint science and still enjoy looking at fingerprints today. It's one of the favorite things I do here at the museum is when I have my fingerprint workshop and I get to see the fingerprints of all our guests. So it's a lot of fun.
And the big fancy word is dactyloscopy.
Dactyloscopy is the study of fingerprints, yes.
So that's your big science word for the day, dactyloscopy. All right, so I've also got Ken's Facebook page pulled up here, so if you'd like to drop some comments or questions in, I'll try to peek at those as we're working through. We've got a pretty busy session, so I can't guarantee I'll get to the comments, but we'll come back to those afterward if we have a chance as well. All right, so why don't you just take a second to remind everybody what a fingerprint is and why we call them fingerprints.
Yes, so a fingerprint is basically a pattern that is created from your friction-ridged skin. And we only find friction-ridged skin on two places on your body, and that is the entire surface of your hands and the entire soles of your feet. And as we talked about last week, it's a unique design because it does give us traction and friction so that we can hold things without dropping them. We can walk without slipping. And so our friction skin is not flat and smooth. It has an uneven surface. So similar you see in this bubble wrap. Only on our friction skin we have a unique pattern. But it does roll like these mountains and valleys that you see here. So we have these mountain peaks and then we have these dips or furrows in between. So your fingerprint pattern is a unique design created by these mountain peaks that we see here that create a unique pattern in every single person. All 10 of your fingers are completely different from your 10 toe prints. So every person has 20 unique fingerprint patterns, unlike anyone who lived in the past, is living in the present, or is going to be born in the future. So it's a pretty amazing thing when you think about the billions of fingerprints out there. But no two are alike. Not even identical twins have the same fingerprints.
Yeah, we think of even a comment about the stars. We know there are trillions and trillions of stars in the universe. And they're all unique, and they all have their different chemical signatures and things. And God knows everyone by name. And just a reminder of His care in creation, all of those things. So last week we also discussed the different patterns, the different shapes that we see. So there are three basic patterns that we see in everybody's fingerprint. And if you were to look at your finger, maybe if you had a little
magnifying
glass.
glass.
I want to say microscope, but I don't think we get a finger under the microscope. Magnifying glass, you can look at those and see them, even if we put a little bit of black paint like we talked about last week, or buying some real fingerprint powder, some of those things. What are the three basic shapes we've got here?
Yes, so the three basic fingerprint types are a loop, all right? Now, loop is the most common fingerprint pattern that we see in humans. 65% of all fingerprint patterns are some type of loop. So when you're trying to identify a loop pattern, I want you to imagine that you see a little slide here, because that's exactly what you see. You have the bottom of the slide here, you climb up the slide, and then you slide down. You can almost see that distinct pattern in the core here. That is a loop pattern. The second most common type we have is a whirl pattern, all right? This looks very much like a Cinnabon, all right? Think of that hot glaze all over the top. That's just what it looks like. It whirls round and round and round, all right? And that's a whirl pattern. Now, there are variations to this, but this is the most common whirl pattern. And then the third type is the arch, right? And the arch is the rarest type of fingerprint pattern. When we define an arch, we say the ridges flow from one side, they gently peak, and then flow out the other side. So it looks just like almost like a little hill in the middle of the fingerprint pattern.
So you don't get the steep shape that you get over here.
Right. You don't get this distinct loop pattern here. You're not getting the hurricane type pattern that you see here, which is interesting. No two hurricanes are the same either.
Yes.
Their roll patterns are unique as well. And then we have our arch pattern there.
Okay. So all of these different designs, the different patterns that we see, then every single little ridge is different on every one of your fingers and on everyone's fingers.
Exactly, because if there's billions of fingerprints, literally billions of fingerprints, and there's only 3 types of patterns, right?
Yeah.
Well, what's making your loop different from mine? Because we determined last week we both had loops,
Yes.
right? So what makes ours unique? And that goes to something we call minutia, all right, or details. Basically, it's what that word means. And so what we find in fingerprint patterns is they are made of little tiny details, and each little tiny detail has a different name, all right? So you can see here where we have like this delta region. This is like this little triangle region that you see here. This is at the bottom of the slide in a loop, all right? We also see we have pores. Those are our sweat pores, which we're going to talk about in just a minute. We do have these little islands, which is like a little tiny piece of friction skin all by itself. It looks just like a little island. Something called a ridge ending, and this is where your fingerprint ridge just stops and doesn't continue. It is called a ridge ending, so that would be a point of unique identity for you, all right? Bifurcations are very, very common. I'd say bifurcation and ridge ending are the 2 most common. A bifurcation is when you have a single ridge that splits into 2.
So it would be like 2 fingers coming out.
Right, it
forking
bifurcates,
apart.
right?
Yes.
Bi means 2,
Bi
right?
means 2.
So we have a single splitting into 2, and this point where it splits, this is also called a fork. You might see it called that on some fingerprint sources as well. This point is be another point of minutia, all right? And sometimes you have this crossover where it almost makes like this X that you see here.
Yeah.
And sometimes you'll actually have what's called an enclosure, where you have a little tiny circle that you see right here, or it's called a lake sometimes, okay? This little tiny circle that you see here. These are all what we call points of minutia. And so on one fingertip, so we're talking on just one tip of one finger, you can have over 150 points of these minutia, all right, in the unique location unlike anyone else.
Yeah. So that would allow
a lot of
even
identification.
each of my fingers, if I have the same basic pattern on multiple fingers, each one I might have at a given spot on the pad of my finger, I would have a forking structure, the bifurcation, or maybe a ridge ending. So one's got a bifurcation there and one has a ridge end there, and I could tell that's a different finger.
It's going to be different, right? The structure of this minutia is going to be different on every single finger, and 150 points on every finger. So we're looking at one individual having over 10,000 points of minutia that's unique to them.
Okay, so another feature you mentioned a minute ago is that there are pores in the surface of our hands and our feet.
Yes.
And they are primarily sweat glands.
Yes.
There's a lot of glands in our skin that release sweat and oils and other things. And those are actually what allow us to do the fingerprinting process.
Exactly,
that we're going to take advantage of those things.
Yeah, so God created us, our human anatomy is pretty amazing, and so He created us to sweat all the time, and it's basically to maintain homeostasis. That's one of the unique features of it. And it's something we call involuntary, right? Because we can't look at our hands and say, I refuse to sweat, right?
I don't want
to sweat right now, right?
That
you just
would be
can't
very
do it,
handy
right?
for me. I'm out disc golfing and my hands get sweaty.
Right.
I can't hold on to them.
I am not going to sweat.
Sweating.
Right.
It doesn't
We
work
can't
that way.
do that. It happens all the time, all right? And so on the surface of those mountain peaks that we talked about are our sweat pores. And you can almost see them reflected in these photographs. These little tiny white dots that you see here, well, these are sweat pores, all right? And they line single file the exact copy of our friction-rich skin, all right? So your sweat pores make a copy of that fingerprint pattern on every single thing that they touch. And you really only have to touch something about 1 second, right? You just touch it and you've already left behind an exact copy of your fingerprint pattern because it's being secreted all the time. Now there's basically 3 types of sweat glands. We have eccrine sweat glands, we have African sweat glands, and we have sebaceous sweat glands. What it primarily is comprised on the surface of the hands and feet is something called eccrine sweat glands. African sweat glands are kind of under your arms and other distinct areas of the body. And then we
Those
have
are the ones that give us the odor that we
right,
don't like.
that smell that we get when we sweat. And then we have sebaceous glands, which are largely connected to our hair follicles. And since we pretty much have hair all over our body, except for the surface of our hands, the soles of our feet, and our lips, right? Only 3 places we don't have hair. That's where we're going to find sebaceous glands. So primarily what we're going to be looking at is that eccrine glands that secrete these oils that we find in fingerprints. But it's important to realize that because we're constantly touching other parts of our body, touching our face, which we're not supposed to do right now.
You're picking up
right?
those oils.
We're not supposed to be touching our face right now, unless you've washed your hands.
I just did, yes.
But, yes. But because we're touching our bodies all the time and other things, often what we find left behind in those fingerprints is not just eccrine secretions, but all those, a variety of a mixture of chemical compounds is what we find. So in our eccrine sweat glands, it's primarily water. It's about 99% water is what we secrete. And so when water's left behind, what usually happens fairly quickly?
There are salts in there, and when the water evaporates,
water's going to evaporate.
Tiny deposits there.
Right, and it's going to leave behind what we call a latent fingerprint. Now, actually, when we have what we call fresh fingerprint, something that's not too old, something like powders is going to work great on that because it will adhere to that moisture that's still there. But oftentimes, fingerprints aren't found when they're fresh, right? So that water has evaporated, and so it's going to be leaving behind amino acids, right? There's about 14 different amino acids that they've identified in fingerprint residue. It's going to leave behind fatty acids because we find those secreted as well. So just depending on the secretions that are there, then there are different processing techniques that we can use to try and bring to light those hidden, or what we call latent fingerprints. Because most often what's left behind is what we call hidden prints or latent prints. We don't visibly see them. Now sometimes you get lucky, right? And someone has literally left a very visible fingerprint behind, and that's really great. But normally what you have to do is search for that.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the techniques that you would use in a crime scene investigation where something's happened in a room, or you're suspicious of somebody and you're trying to get a fingerprint from them. How do we go about doing some of those things?
Right.
Let's talk about a couple of those.
The first thing you have to determine is what kind of surface am I looking at, right? Because there are different processes that we'll use depending on whether it's a porous surface or a non-porous surface, right? That's going to distinguish the type of chemical or the type of powder or the type of method I may use to process it.
Just like a pore in our skin, now that's spelled P-O-R-E, as we're talking about that. So the pores that are in our skin are little tiny holes that allow things to come out of them. This tabletop, we would say, is a non-porous surface. If I pour something like water on it, it would not absorb into it. But paper, for example, is very porous. So it's going to absorb a lot of things better. So porous substances have little holes in them that absorb all of those things. So this paper, if I put my fingerprint on there, is not going to leave as good of a print as if I do it here on the tabletop.
Well, it may, because this is absorbent, so it's going to absorb those oils that you left behind. We would just have to use a different method to find it.
So that's the difference.
That's the difference, right? It's not so much that the print's not there, it's just, well, what method do I need to use? The correct method.
And that's why the training and all those things that you've gone through help us understand those things.
Yes, so we're going to be looking at processes today that you can do at home. All right. Now, just know that if you're working in a crime scene unit or in a forensics lab, there are a lot more advanced chemicals. Technology is amazing. All right, and what they have come up with in just the last 5 years, many even involve noxious chemicals, and we'd have to have vent hoods and all that. So these are things you really couldn't do at home. So we're going to focus on things you can do at home and have fun today processing some fingerprints. All right. So the first thing we're going to look at is actually the oldest method that fingerprint examiners have used to process latent fingerprints, and it's called iodine fuming. It was developed in the early 20th century. All right, so you're going to see back here we have just a standard disposable storage container. All right, don't go get your mom's expensive Tupperware. All right, or let's ask her first. Right, so you're going to need some kind of disposable container. You're also going to need iodine tincture, which you can buy at the store.
Yeah, so that would be in the first aid section.
It's like a concentrated type iodine, all right? So you're going to need just a little bottle of this. You can pick that up at pretty much any pharmacy or grocery store. Should have iodine tincture, okay? Disposable container, and then you're going to need some kind of dish. It can be any kind of little dish. It could even be a lid of something.
Yeah, like a lid from a soda bottle if you take the rubber cap out of it.
Inside your container, just like this, okay? Now, iodine is one of those chemicals that we would use to process porous surfaces. It is the oldest method to process any type of paper document. So if you had forged checks or wills, right, diaries, things like that, we would use iodine fuming. Iodine fuming, the biggest problem with iodine fuming is that it is not permanent. So those fingerprints that you're able to process do not stay forever. And so either you have to photograph it quickly once you see the friction-ridged skin, or you can actually do a little trick at home. If you are successful in getting iodine prints, you can actually just take some water that your mom boiled in her potatoes in, starch water, spray onto your iodine prints, and you'll have a permanent record that way.
Because the starch reacts with the iodine to make a
reacts
color
with the
change
fatty acids that are present that iodine fuming works with.
Yep.
All right. Now, in a crime scene lab, you would have they actually have iodine fuming cabinets, but this kind of simulates that. All right. You can do the same thing because all we really need is the iodine fumes.
Yes.
The iodine fumes are going to cause a chemical reaction. They actually oxidize onto the surface where you've left the prints behind. So what we're going to do is have Mr. Patterson leave behind his prints. Now, when you're doing this at home, it's always best, like we said, we want to get a mixture of chemicals. So I always recommend take your hand, rub behind your neck where you're kind of oily and sweaty. Behind your ears is good. On the sides of your nose is always good.
I
your
just
forehead.
took a shower this morning,
right.
though.
So you kind of want to just get extra oil, and then all you need to do is just kind of press your fingerprints onto some paper. All right. You're going to put it into your fuming chamber. Okay. And you do want to fold the paper so that it's not laying flat.
Tinted a little bit.
You're going to take your iodine tincture, and you only need just a little bit into the dish. You don't need to, pour the whole bottle in. Just a little bit into the bottom of the dish. And then you are just going to seal up your container. Okay? Because you want to make sure you have a container that does seal pretty well.
Yes.
Okay?
Because we're trying to capture the fumes.
We want to capture the fumes to adhere to those oils. We're going to have an oxidation reaction.
Yep.
Okay?
And to get that to go faster,
yes,
you could heat it in some type of a water bath.
Yes, so you can actually take this, put it into a hot water bath, a bigger container with hot water, and it will speed it up dramatically.
Yep.
Now, what you want to look for is friction ridge detail. Now, this is an example that I did this morning that I accidentally left in there too long, which you can do. So you do want to watch iodine fuming. It's not something you can leave and forget about.
Yeah.
You can over process it, it's called. But you can see where I started to get friction ridge detail right here on this index card. There's another fingerprint showing up right here. All right. Now, this is a second one I did. Now, I do not leave behind very good fingerprints. My ridges are wore down. It can kind of happen. It happens to moms because, we're in water a lot, we're cooking.
Yes.
So this one, you can start to see some showing up. And this is after about 20 minutes in a hot water bath. So iodine fuming can take, a little bit of time. So just keep checking on it over an hour, okay? But this is an excellent method you can do at home. Just remember, it's not permanent, but anything paper type or porous surface, iodine fuming
All right,
is
we'll
excellent
keep an eye on these and come back to this
Come
in
back
a few
and
minutes
see if we
captured
get anything.
any of my fingerprints.
All right, so now we're going to look at non-porous surfaces.
All right.
Which is usually the most common type surface that we're going to encounter, at a crime scene. Windowsills, windows, glass panes, things like that, cups left behind.
Door frames that have been painted. And
yes,
those types of
right,
things.
would be a non-porous surface. And so what you're going to need for this is you're going to need some type of powder and some type of brush. All right. Now, in a crime scene unit, there are different types of brushes, and some of them are made out of camel hair, some of them are made out of different types of hair. This is actually a very old one, but it's the best one that I own. It was actually my father's when he used to work in the unit. Yes. Sometimes you get little detective kits like this that you can buy online that have these brushes in it. This brush does not work well.
It's probably a little
it's
too
stiff. Right.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful with your brush choice.
Now, if it's too stiff, it's going to basically wipe away the print.
Right. So if you try to use a paintbrush like this,
not going to work
it's not going to work because
you're going to wipe the print.
You're going to wipe away
those ridges.
Exactly that you've left behind. So your brush choice is important. So at home, some things that you can use is like Mom's blush brush, right? If she has one that's similar to this.
Yes, with Mom's permission.
With Mom's
course.
permission. And with Mom's blush brush, you can also use Mom's blush, okay? Blush works great at home. Eyeshadow, if it's like in a compact, you might need to just, scrape it off a little bit. You can also take a pencil and file it, a pencil lead down, and use that as well.
So the graphite powder would
Right,
work
graphite
well.
powder will work great. So these are all options you can use at home, but don't use the
Big
stiff paintbrush.
Yep.
You won't get any ridge detail at all. So we're going to have Mr. Patterson practice using a little black powder today. Now, fingerprint powder comes in all types of colors. This is just a small example, but you can get blue and green. They have it in different colors because there's all different types of surfaces and colors. So we need to be able to contrast against anything we're trying to, locate a latent fingerprint.
Yeah, so if it were on a blue surface, something like this,
you may want to use something else. And then there is like fluorescent type powder that will work with the UV light as well. So that's a lot of fun.
So
you can take the UV light.
I doubt we're going to be able to see it.
I don't know if you're going to be able to see it. Yeah, it's not going to work well.
But in a darkened room.
Right, darkened room, right. So we're just going to start with a little black powder. All right, now this is the oldest, most traditional method that is out there. It's just using traditional black powder.
I'm going to grab this bottle.
All right, he's touching the bottle. Now it only takes a little tiny bit. It doesn't take a whole lot of black powder. And black powder is extremely messy, all right? So it is not really the favorite choice of crime scene investigators anymore, but we'll talk about what that is in just a minute, all right?
So at this point, should I put on gloves or something to not contaminate the scene?
We need to put on gloves because we don't want to get our own fingerprints, right, onto the evidence, especially when we're trying to lift those fingerprints. So it's always very important that you do put on gloves.
Okay.
And then I'm going to need you to get your evidence kit that you have here.
All right.
Okay. Now, crime scene personnel always have a kit that has all the supplies that we need in that. So if you go ahead and open that up, you're going to see that, now that's magnet powder. We're going to use this powder. We're going to use that in just a minute. And you're going to see that you have tape. You have some kind of packing tape. All right. You can use Scotch tape as well, but really some kind of packing tape works best. And you're going to need your backer cards that are down there, the white index cards. Yep.
Those ready?
Okay, so we are trying to lift with black powder a fingerprint off the glass that you just touched.
All right.
Okay, now you can pick your brush of choice, but this really is the best one. So you want to go ahead and just very lightly kind of spin it.
Very lightly.
All right, right. You kind of spin the brush in the powder.
I'm twisting this with my fingers as it goes in to help absorb that powder into those fibers. Okay.
Now, when you go to dust your surface, what you're doing is you're going to be spinning, right? Because we don't want to mess up that friction ridge detail that's left behind. Now, as he's spinning, I can already see, once you see ridge detail appear, you kind of want to stop for a minute, right?
Yeah.
And you want to say, okay, I see
a fingerprint
right here. Now, once you identify the friction skin, the goal is to kind of then brush with the ridge flow as lightly as possible.
So if I can look at the direction of the ridges, I think I see it that direction.
So you kind of still, right, you kind of just lightly brush.
Very light. I'm
very
putting no
light,
pressure
because we don't want to smear it, right?
Yep. Oh, I can see a greasy fingerprint line there. Let's see if we can grab.
You have some nice oily fingerprints.
Yeah.
You should not be committing any crime scenes, that's for sure.
I would be in trouble leaving those things everywhere. And I have a very unique scar on one of my fingers.
We'll have to see if it shows up. We'll talk about scars.
All
right, so the next thing we're going to do is we're going to try and lift this fingerprint, okay? Because we want to keep a record of it. This wouldn't be a good way to keep this fingerprint, and it'd be very hard to examine this way. So we need to lift it off of our glass jar and put it onto something where we can look at it, all right? So we use black powder, so the best thing to put a black powder print on is something white, okay, so that we can see it. So you take a little piece of tape, and what you always do is start above where that print is that you're trying to lift, and then you're going to take your finger and gently smooth it over that print because you don't want any air bubbles. That's always key. So kind of just take it and then smooth it over.
But I'm not letting this go down and contact the other side of the glass.
Right. It's a lot easier if you don't. Right.
Okay. I think I'm
going to hold this so you can get it off. You're going to pull your tape off very carefully. All right, and then you're going to do the exact same thing when you lay it on your backer card. You're going to start on one side and then gently kind of smooth it across. Excellent work.
You don't want to put too much pressure there.
Right.
Or you're going to smear you got a little smearing there.
Now, important thing to remember with this type of technique, especially when we're lifting prints off glass surfaces, it's usually a one-shot chance, right? So you have to be very careful.
Print is
all right?
gone now.
So now, if we take a look at this fingerprint, we can see sufficient, wonderful.
Let's set it down here.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Wonderful friction ridge detail here. You can even see down to his creases here. All right? Now, here's what's really amazing. If we have over 10,000 points of minutia, right, and there's 150 in one fingerprint, how many points do you think, and when we say points, we're talking about these little minutia details. How many do we need to go to court and say, yes, Mr. Patterson, that is you with 100% accuracy?
6.
You do need more than 6.
More than 6.
They have a national standard now that's 10.
10, all right.
So the judge likes to see 10.
10 points.
But when you think about 10, that's a 1 by 1 centimeter square area of one fingerprint,
Okay,
basically.
so we don't need a full fingerprint.
Do not need
we
a
don't
full
need
fingerprint.
multiple prints.
So this would be sufficient to convict you.
Yep. And that's
Yes.
the one that has my scar on it.
Yes.
And you can see that little white circle right in the middle. That's where the point of that
Exactly.
scar is.
So sometimes people ask and say, well, I have a scar, or I've burned myself, right? Or I've cut myself and I have a scar. Is it going to impede the ability to identify me? It's important to realize it doesn't,
No.
right? Because you still have like 125 other points around that scar that give you unique identity. And really a scar is
It is
considered
pretty unique.
a point of unique identity as well.
And the story of how I got that scar is even more unique, but we'll leave that for
Oh,
another.
okay. Everybody's going to want to know now how you got that scar. All right, so that is black powder. All right.
Now this would work with mom's blush.
Blush,
types of
right,
things.
mom's blush,
but
makeup,
you're gonna get,
pencil
if you
lead,
use a
right.
tan-colored blush or something,
Right.
or you'd want to put it on a dark
Dark,
colored
right.
paper.
If you're using like a light pink blush, you may
Yeah.
want to get a colored paper to
Yeah.
really see it. Yeah, definitely. Okay. Now, something else we're going to show you. Black powder works great, and that's a fun thing you can try at home. But nothing we're going to try is, you're probably going to need that tape. Yeah. Is we're going to show you how to use Magna powder. All right. Now, Magna powder really is almost a preferred choice because it's very clean. You can see black powder gets everywhere and it's very, very messy. But Magna powder can actually be cleaned up very nicely. Magna powder, as with regular colored, comes in different colors. So we have red and black Magna powder here, but we're going to use the black today because I will say the red's very messy. Okay. So in here we do have Magna powder. Now Magna powder is magnetized,
It's got
right?
little iron particles in it.
So what you have in your wand, we call this a wand. That would be a brush, right? So we're not going to use that brush because that's for,
Okay.
don't want to use that anymore. That's for powder.
We'll set it over
Yeah.
here.
So we're going to use a wand, all right? And the magnetic wand picks up the iron, basically what it is in the powder. Now, what's really neat about when you're using a Magna wand is that all you have to do is pull the little arm up and release that,
That
and then
pulls
you
the magnet
out,
away from the
and then
powder.
you can go back and let all the dust fall in, and then you can clean up whatever's been left behind, right? So it's much, much cleaner than black powder. All right. So we're going to go ahead and let you try to do that. So let's get our glass jar again, and see if you can find another area where you may have touched on there. And we're going to just show you real quick how Magna powder works. Now, this is probably something you can't do at home, right? Because you have to have magnetic powder. But it works great. So you don't ever want to touch the actual wand to the glass, just the
powder.
just the
so I'm
powder.
just brushing it across.
It's the same
the
idea.
surface there.
You're just going to be brushing. You're looking for friction-ridged skin.
I think I see some
I think I do too. Yes.
right there. Good print there.
Oh, yeah, there's a nice one right there. I see it. So you're going to do the exact same thing that you just did with your black powder once you find your Magna powder print.
Okay, there's my lines of, I can see the direction of the ridges. I know you can't see that on the camera, but your eyeball, God has created with a lot more acuity, ability to see detail than this little camera
Yes,
has.
so you're going to see a lot more detail when you do this at home than we can show you here. Absolutely.
Okay.
So let's move this over here. I'm going to go ahead and clean up for you real quick
right.
so we can get all this out of the way. And if they come to our forensics camp this summer, they'll actually get to use Magna powder and get to process with that.
That'd be great fun. All right, if you want to hold that still,
Yes, I'll hold
get
this.
another piece of tape. See that?
And learning to pick up fingerprints with tape just takes practice. If you don't have gloves at home, it's okay. Just remember your fingerprints will be on the edges of the tape. Okay. You can still play around with fingerprints even if you don't have gloves at home.
That bottle is curved, and that's creating a challenge. Okay, I think we'll get enough of the... All right, let's peel that back carefully. Got my backer card here again.
Now you can almost see the Magna powder. It's the fingerprints come out almost more distinct, and you can almost see that
over
here.
to the edge so
Right, so you can see the black powder here and the Magna powder here, and the detail's much better with the Magna powder.
Now, if we were to look at this under a magnifying glass or some type of stereoscope where we could see
Or a
the image
magnifying app
better.
on your phone works great
Yes.
too. Yes.
Use your camera and zoom in on that with the magnifier.
Mm-hmm.
You would actually see those details a lot better than we're seeing
Right.
through the camera here again.
Yes.
And then what about computer analysis?
Yes. So when we find a latent print at a crime scene, and let's say we want to run it against the database, we want to say, hey, will this match anything? They just take this, they feed in the computer, and the computer picks out these points of minutia we talked about.
Okay, so we've created computer programs that
Yes.
basically would do what a detective would sit down in front of a screen and compare slides next to one another.
Or
hundreds
through
of
really
slides.
through two little lenses is what we use. Two
Yeah,
lenses
right
and
next to
compare.
one another.
Right. Now a computer can do it in, well, it depends. It varies. It can take a few hours. It just depends on how much of the print is there. And
But it can analyze a much larger
right.
database.
Everything in the
Yeah.
database looking to search, has Mr. Patterson been fingerprinted before and is he in the system? Right.
Yes.
Computer could do that for us. Yes,
So
absolutely.
those are the basics. Oh, let's see if we've got anything on
Yes.
our iodine print here. Oh, we do. Okay, so we can bring this over
Very
here. and let the
nice.
camera come
Yes. So you can see, and it was really just, about 10 minutes
Yeah.
that we were able to process Mr. Patterson's fingerprints with iodine fuming, something you can easily do at home.
in. Yep.
Yeah.
All right, so these are some techniques you can use to kind of simulate that crime scene investigation at home. But when we think about this is a good reminder of God's justice. God is a God of justice and righteousness. And this is a way that He has given governments and people authority to act in His place.
Yes.
So we have earthly justice, and so this is part of that. When people violate laws, they're sinning against God. And so bringing them to justice in an earthly sense happens sometimes, but it's a reminder that there's eternal justice.
Yes.
That God doesn't need fingerprints to know that a crime has been committed. He sees everything and knows everything. And while that might bring us a bit of fear, we don't need to have fear if we know there's a
Right.
way that justice can be served.
been paid
we've
for.
we've just celebrated Easter
Yes.
this weekend, and that's a reminder that justice was served on Christ and not on us.
Yes.
And so good reminders for us of how we get to reflect God as His image bearers, but also that He's been gracious to us in those
Yes.
things.
And what's really amazing too, if you think about all these processes that we used, the fact that we can even use these orderly mechanisms is evidence that someone had to design that, right? It couldn't
Yeah.
happen by random
Yes.
chance. There had to be someone who created
Each of
this
these
orderly
unique
process for us to
pieces. Yeah.
use. Yes. So it's just amazing it's so much fun to study. Yeah, absolutely.
All right, I'm sure we could go on for a
We
lot
could,
longer
yes.
and do lots more fun things. But I hope that was educational for you. We really hope you'll get to try a few of these techniques at home. I would love to remind you that we've got more programs coming to you today, again at noon and 3 and 7. We'll have more things coming to you. And we also have a special offer we're starting this week that is a $10 off offer if you are going to be purchasing products from our website. And you can use the code SAVE10, and that's good through April 30th. So you've got $10 off and free shipping for those things. And I'd love to highlight that book again that we talked about last week. And that is The Work of Your Hand. And Dr. Rivera has written this to talk about God's unique creation of fingerprints. A great book for younger kids.
Yes.
All right, that's all the time we've got for today. And we thank you for joining us. And we pray that this has been a blessing to your family and hope that you will all get out and explore God's amazing creation.